Hello and welcome to Policy Watch, your packed snapshot on the week's biggest business stories, their context, relevance and impact. I'm Govindraj, Ethiraj. Well, retail and wholesale inflation figures showed a marked dip this week, bringing in cheer for policymakers and consumers. The latest official data, the wholesale price index dipped to its 5-year low of 2.38% in September. Retail inflation, measured as consumer price index, came down to 6.46%, its lowest since January 2012, when the government started releasing a new series of retail prices. The Finance Minister Arun Jaitley said prices of diet proteins and vegetables have shrunk due to the steps taken by the government. He expressed confidence that the country was on its way to achieving a low and stable price regime. Mr. Jaitley informed that the government was working on a new monetary policy framework under which it will fix the inflation target for the Reserve Bank of India to achieve. Now, India's banking sector regulator, the Reserve Bank, has set a target to bring down retail prices to 6% by 2015. Now, there was also relief this week for oil importing countries like India. Crude prices fell to the $80 to $84 per barrel mark in the international market thanks to weak global demand and a supply glut. Now, the North Brent crude was selling for $83 a barrel this week, its lowest in 4 years. Now, we shall discuss the opportunities that these two developments present for India's growth. India grew at 5% in 2013-14 after witnessing sub-5% growth in 2012-13. And I'm joined by Arvind, Virmani, former Chief Economic Advisor and Executive Director at the International Monetary Fund, and now President of Chintan Live, also joined by Abheek, Barua, consultant to the Ethiraj. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Dr. Virmani, let me begin with you. We seem to be heading for an interesting phase, what some people call the Goldilocks period of low inflation and high growth. Is it early to call that, or should we be still waiting to pop the bubbly, as it were?
Definitely too early to call that because you need policy changes to bring that about. As you mentioned, the inflation trend is very clear. In fact, last month I argued that it's on the way down, and I'm happy to have it confirmed this month's data. But you need to adjust the monetary and fiscal policy mix. Now, my judgment is that fiscally we are already on the trend which has been outlined by the government, and we will, I'm fairly confident the minister will achieve the 3% he is outlined for 2 years down the road, 3% of GDP. So, in my view, it's time now to start adjusting the monetary policy. Because the data on the production side is still pretty bad, and we need to get moving now to start seeing its results in Q3 and Q4.
Right. So you're saying interest rates are still a critical component of the mix, and they should be...
Yes, because macro policy means the fiscal monetary policy has to be adjusted. And one of the arguments against loosening monetary policy was the fisc was too loose. Now, for various reasons, including what government has done and what has happened externally, I think we are well on the way to that, and we need to adjust the policy to achieve the growth part of it.
Okay. Abheek, what's your sense of this mix?
Yeah, I would completely endorse what Dr. Virmani has said, and I think by definition a Goldilocks economy would have a combination of falling inflation and rising growth. I certainly don't see the rising growth bit of it, and it's certainly not visible in some of the official data that has come out. If you just look at the industrial production data, the latest industrial production data, which is hugely disappointing.
Right.
So I think we need to get that up before you can even sort of define it as a Goldilocks scenario.
Yeah.
And for that, as Dr. Virmani pointed out, monetary policy might not be entirely sort of adequate to bring growth up, but it's certainly one of the factors that needs to be in place to push demand and growth up.
Right. So let's look at the other two factors, right? So oil prices are coming down, commodity prices are down, which in itself should be good, but it also reflects a certain weakening in the global economy. So how do you take the two and interpret them?
No, I'm glad you raised that, because I think we tend to get a little carried away by falling oil prices or commodity prices and claim that we are a net importer and it should be good for us. But the flip side is that all this, the weakness in commodity prices, is signaling a huge amount of nervousness among international investors, at least, about growth conditions. And so if that were the case, I think the next question that I'd like to ask is, which is the next domino that's going to fall after the commodity markets? Would it be the emerging markets? Would capital flows be compromised? So, I mean, I would be a little sort of circumspect about that.
Okay? The other way, the way I would look at it is to say that exactly as he indicated, that the global economy is weak. So is very weak. You know, we've had these repeated downgrade of projections by the IMF, World Bank. So it's a warning. We still have to fall back on domestic policies. Don't depend on the external environment. It's nice to have the oil price increase, but on the other side, the growth side, which we know is still an issue to be addressed, means that you have to do more on the domestic side. And we can discuss. Of course, things are happening.
Yeah. So how does one interpret falling, I mean, from an economic point of view, sitting in India and looking out or looking in from outside, how does one look at falling oil prices? Then the fact that oil companies are also now looking at profits on diesel, which is an unheard of phenomenon.
Yeah, but it's both. I mean, as he just said, you know, the one side is it gives us time, right? Because across the board, where there's fiscal, external balance, and so on, you get this transfer. You know, the way I used to explain it when I was in government was that it's a lower price means you're getting a net transfer from the rest of the world, or vice versa. I mean, usually it was the other way. You're paying the rest of the world. So it gives a big boost to demand, you know, and we expect there'll be a pass-through. But what he's indicated and what I'm also emphasizing is that it means that you cannot depend on external demand to revive the economy. You know, the rest of the world is not going to help you, which means you've got to fall back on domestic demand, whether it's consumption or investment, which means you've got to bring that reforms even more strongly.
And to what extent are we dependent? I mean, for instance, if you look at the last growth jump that we saw, or spike we saw, external conditions or the external economy was also relevant and perhaps played a key role in that.
Well, it's useful that the American economy is recovering, but on the other hand, a lot of exporters are oriented towards Europe. So that is, you know, net zero. I mean, exaggerating a bit. So clearly, those who are connected to the U.S. economy can use it, the IT sector, etc. I think we are already seeing a little bit of that boom. So you have to exploit whatever is available. But the point I'm again re-emphasizing is that the complacency is unwarranted, which is kind of what your question is, because you have to do more to revive the domestic investment.
Right.
You know, that's not going to I mean, if the animal spirits across the world generally are not very good, that means you've got to do more domestically.
Okay.
Just to get back to your question, just a quick point on the boom that we had in the mid-2000s. There was a significant external demand component to it. And if you, for instance, look at manufacturing, exports played a very, very critical role, at least in incremental, you know, demand. So, you know, that was a factor that we could sort of take for granted then, which we can't do now, which gets back to Dr. Virmani's point that it's now entirely sort of up to domestic factors and the push.
So the sense I'm getting is do not allow this to lull ourselves into complacency. That's the biggest lesson, right? What's the next big thing or the next most important thing, Abheek, and then Dr. Virmani?
No, I think as a, you know, reforms. I mean, we made a start with, you know, the proverbial low-hanging fruit on the labour front. I think we need a lot more sort of initiative.
Yeah, actually, you know, we talked about the budget, we talked about tax terrorism. I think that issue has not really been resolved. So, in fact, I would say that should be the first focus, because whatever one has heard from international business and the little feedback one has, it tells us that even though these things have been announced, there's a lot more digging in which has to be done. You know, you can't just announce it because bureaucracies are very hard to move. I mean, we are moving on the ease of business, but we are not really haven't addressed this whole tax and related issues.
Well, we need to go in for a break, but after the break, we'll talk about the new slew of labour reform measures that the Prime Minister has announced to fight the entrenched Inspector Raj. Welcome back. Prime Minister Narendra Modi unveiled an array of labour reforms this week, a roadmap to winding up the country's notorious Inspector Raj. Under the new programme titled Shramev Jayate, a slew of measures are designed to curb the discretionary powers of labour inspectors and simplify the compliance process on labour-related issues. The new system will have a compliant-based inspection system based on data and evidence. It is mandatory for a labour inspector to give a report within 72 hours. Launch of the Shram Suvidha portal was another step towards changing labour laws. This would enable online compliance of labour laws through a single window and a single form to remove the need to file data on 16 forms today. The employees will be allotted a lifetime universal account number or UAN for their PF accounts that will not change even if they switch jobs. The government also replaced the Finance Secretary Arvind Mairam with Rajasthan's Chief Secretary Rajiv Merishi, who's said to be, and this is said to be another move towards wider economic reforms. Merishi is considered investor-friendly and is known for initiating free market policies in the state of Rajasthan. The government also appointed Arvind Subramaniam as the Chief Economic Advisor. He is a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, and he will work with the new Finance Secretary Rajiv Merishi for next year's crucial budget. Well, back with me in the studio, Arvind Virmani and Abheek Barua. So, Abheek, let me begin with you. Another set of low-hanging fruits have been picked in some ways.
Right.
Do you agree?
No, I mean, just let me sort of put it very, very simplistically. I think there are about, if you combine the centre and states, there are about 146 separate bits of labour legislation that impinge on a manufacturing company. Only a few of them have been addressed. There are more critical legislations like the Industrial Disputes Act, which is sort of incorrectly interpreted as a way to hire and fire. It's much more than that. Then there's the Apprenticeship Act, which is extremely draconian and stands in the way of companies taking on apprentices. So a lot of, this is just a beginning. This is, as someone put it, the first chapter. But this is just the introduction. You need to sort of get through the more complex bits of the story before it's a done deal.
Dr. Vedmani, if I were to say, look at the whole Make in India initiative that's been announced. These are all the building or the unbuilding blocks for that.
Right.
And so what else is left?
I'll make 2 points which perhaps have not been made in public. One is that there's a lot of attention. Well, basic is, of course, the ease of doing business, which is very critical for the Make in India. But I think the important thing is a lot of attention is being paid to political economy aspects. So, in some sense, what has been done so far really is going to benefit the small and medium. It's not going to be an immediate driver of growth, which has to come from the corporate investment, which is down drastically, which connects to our Make in India and what I said about the taxation. But it's a good thing because you have to pay attention to political economy. So you have to, and the second part of that, one is the small and medium, the other is the labor part, which you said in your introduction. That making it easier for labor to move, very important for political economy. Again, the impact is not immediate, but it'll be over time, right? So, and that's what I call political economy in a sense, because you won't get a big bang right away. Now, the big bang will probably come from things which affect the corporate sector more, because that's where you've had the drastic decline in investment.
Right. So, what are the other hurdles that one can or the government should be looking at? But maybe they're relatively lower hanging fruit.
So, we've all discussed earlier, the land part of it still remains. But even more important, as I said, is from whatever little I have heard from people, the tax administration is still not there. And I pointed out in my post-budget comments, which I wrote in a newspaper, was that it's hard. You have to do a lot of work. It's not easy. You can't just say. The minister says that bureaucracy is a tremendous. It goes on its own. The inertia is huge. I have dealt with it. It took me 5-10 years to really understand, get into it, and to work out how to change those things. Okay. So it requires a lot of work.
Okay. So you're saying the tax administration system is something that while has been referred to, but has not seen much action. Abhi? What are the smaller or the maybe not so small steps that we still should be pursuing?
This is a cliche, but I think infrastructure remains the critical impediment to economic activity across the board, including manufacturing. And for Make in India, we certainly need much superior infrastructure. And there was a paper done at my institute, Ethiraj, recently on the export competitiveness of India based on the kind of infrastructure and supply chain facilities that are available. We are way behind some of our Asian peers, including the likes of Vietnam, who's really got their act together very quickly. And you just need to travel in a place like Thailand and so on down there in the
Sure.
industrial corridors just to see the difference. I think we need to get that act together. But what I think is, heartening is that the labor reforms might not be very deep. You need more radical changes in labor regulation. But I think this is, in a sense, a response to a number of issues that foreign investors raised. I mean, I think the process of casualization that was, coming about as a result of the labor laws.
Yeah.
I mean, the Japanese investors were a little concerned because of problems, in industrial strife and so on. So there is an attempt, at least, to recognize and address these questions, these issues, perhaps at a very superficial level to start with, but I think the investor community is getting a sense that their voice is being heard.
Right.
This wasn't happening 6 or 7 months ago.
Right, and there seems to be a combination of the big picture and the small picture. I mean,
Yes.
very, very specific
Yes.
steps. So there's a new team as well at the Finance Ministry. How do you see them rising up to the occasion?
Well, I think it's good to have your own people because in some sense, the whole model here is of leadership as far as I can see. You set the terms, you set the leadership, you set the tone externally, and then let the people in the government do it. And that cannot function unless you have people you trust. So in that sense, I think it's good. I mean, I've been waiting for it. You can't say we are a different administration and then not change anything in the administration because that doesn't give confidence. So in that sense, I don't want to speak of individual.
Sure.
Particularly secretaries, because I really don't know all of them.
Sure.
But I think it's a good that the government should put in place, at least in the key ministries, people whom they trust. And from that perspective, I think it's very good to have that the finance, the secretary DA, a new one, who presumably the minister and the PM trust.
Right, and from at their level, what are the one or two things that you could expect from them to either announce or do?
From my experience, the tone and the direction is set by the minister, and it's very clear the minister and the PM have a direction. So the question then is of delegation and leaving it to a person. You have to have the person you trust. So presumably now some of the things we are discussing on the tax side, etc., these two gentlemen will focus their attention on and do something and try to understand what the problems are, etc. Of course, we still have Partho Shom there in some committee, and I think he's a useful resource. He's also, he knows the system, but there has to be somebody in the administration. He's just an advisor,
right.
A kind of consultant.
Right.
So there has to be people in positions who take an interest in this.
Okay, we need to go in for a break, but after the break, coming up, India's biggest real estate firm, DLF, barred from the securities market for 3 years for fraud. What does that mean for the capital markets? India's biggest real estate firm, DLF, cannot participate in the securities markets for the next 3 years. Stock market regulator SEBI has imposed the ban on the company and 6 of its top directors and promoters. In its order, SEBI said there is a clear case against DLF of fraud and suppressing material information to defraud investors in the company's initial public offer or IPO in 2007. SEBI full-time member Rajiv Agarwal said the violations were grave and had larger implications on the safety and integrity of the securities markets. The ban will be applicable on DLF chairman and main promoter KP Singh, son Rajiv Singh, who is vice chairman, daughter Pia Singh, who is also a whole-time director, managing director TC Goel, and former CFO Ramesh Sanka and Kameshwar Sarup, who was the executive director legal at the time of the IPO. Now, DLF's IPO in 2007 was the biggest in the country at that time and fetched the company 9,187 crore. The market capitalization of the company had crossed 1 lakh crore rupees as a result. The very next day after the order, the stocks fell by nearly 4%. The DLF has a debt of around 20,000 crore rupees and was planning to raise money through an issue of bonds. The company may be forced to sell off some projects at discounts to service its debts, and that could have a dampening effect on other real estate companies as well. Well, to understand what this means for the capital markets as a whole and in general, let me pose the first question to you, Abheek. So, always investors, both external and Indian, are normally asked one question: are the capital markets safe? Can I invest?
I should think so. I think this is a bit of an aberration, and I think the entry of major institutional players into the markets has ensured that, in general, due diligence at the time of an IPO is fairly thorough, and instances like this are likely to be rare. So I don't see this as a part of a pattern or a whole series of cases that are likely to be unearthed soon. I think this was certainly a lapse. But I don't think this is...
so our capital markets are safe, is what you're saying. Yeah. Dr. Virmani?
So, real estate, land and real estate is kind of special. So, first point I would make is that if it has any implications, it's really for only the real estate. And the reason is land markets, we know land markets are very poor, and the history of land and real estate across the world shows that it develops. So clearly, we know that traditionally our land and real estate markets have been kind of, as we say, number two. The fact that these companies are gradually coming in, there will be hiccups. It's sad. It's very unfortunate, but it is inevitable. I mean, it's been an unpleasant process all across the world. So there's a short-term loss in a way, if you want to call it, but a longer-term gain. Because the signal is important, whether it's too harsh or not, I don't know. They are appealing, they'll find out. I don't know the legal details. But in some sense, the SEBI has given a very clear signal, and that's how it happens across the world, so that other companies in real estate who come to the market now have a benchmark they have to judge against. And in the medium to long term, that will mean a much better market for real estate companies in India.
So, as an investor, I should see the regulators' move as being comforting rather than
in the medium long term. Yeah. Of course, the short term effect we know that the markets fall. The other real estate companies in the next 1 or 2 years probably will have a little difficulty. They were thinking of repaying their bond or their debt, etc. So there will be short term problems, and maybe a little delay in the recovery of the real estate sector. We have to be clear about that. But the medium-term gains will, obviously, will over time overwhelm that.
Abheek, so capital markets are safe. The regulator is obviously doing everything he or she can. What's the sense you're getting from an overall fundraising and capital market stability point of view at this point?
Well, clearly, till just a couple of weeks back, there was enormous interest in the India story, rekindled by the various initiatives that have been promised, so on. But I think over the last 2 weeks, I've been a little concerned about, this global shadow of weak growth, of bond yields plummeting in the US equity market not doing too well, largely in sort of response to concerns about the global economy, really sort of coming back in a big way. And there is a feeling among a fairly strong, fairly large section of the investor community that India will be an outlier and will not be affected by this. I'm not entirely convinced by that argument. So I think we need to be a little careful about both capital raising and the direction of capital markets. Okay. At least till the uncertainty about the Fed's next move.
Right. So you're saying the external conditions are something that to be worried about.
Actually, that reminds me of a thing we haven't discussed, which is the recapitalization of the public sector banks. I think in some ways what we just said brings that back into focus. So we are back to the finance ministry. There is an unfinished agenda. I mean, they have to get on the ball in terms of NPAs and raising the capital adequacy,
so the government itself is going to be a big money raiser in the capital markets.
That's right. So those weaknesses which we've been observing for the last 3 years now need to be addressed. So if there is uncertainty, which links up to the point I made earlier, the more uncertainty or lack of growth there is externally, in a way, it's a reminder to us that these things are pending. Let us get our own house in order so that we are less affected or not affected by negative global developments.
Right. But at the same time, we've not seen so much of IPO activity. I mean, it's not like there has been that much of fundraising.
Absolutely. Govind, I think the issue is that there is still a lot of spare capacity in most sectors. The need to add capacity, except fundraising and banking and so on, is just not there because you're looking at fairly low capacity utilization levels. So CapEx, etc., will come a couple of years or a year and a half down the road, and that's when you're likely to see the bulk of the IPO activity if we do actually sort of pick up from these levels in terms of growth.
Right. So, Dr. Virmani, slightly larger question. You know, are you getting a sense that the regulators who govern, whether it's, I mean, business and economy, I mean, are they all, you know, on their toes? I mean, the SEBI order seems to suggest that, you know, even picking up now 5 years after something has happened. 2007 to, 7 years. They seem to be...
Yeah, I noticed that also when you said. I didn't know it was such an old case. But, you know, all these cases take a lot of time. I was in the SEBI tribunal, and it's very hard to get evidence. It's very hard. So, as I mentioned, I'm not sure all these will be upheld. But the important thing is the signal that the regulator is not going to allow it. We've also had actions by CCI. You know, that also... one might say has got active over the last couple of years.
The cement,
on various issues. So all that is good. That, you know, the best regulation is one which signals the people and say, okay, we are going to be tough, so don't do it. And they don't do it. That's the most successful. It's not the actual prosecution and punishing somebody. You know, it's clarifying the gray areas, because the whole point of regulation is, you know, white and black is judged by the legal system. But the gray areas are what the regulator is supposed to clarify. So it has to define those red lines, so to say, within that gray area. And gradually it happens. So that's the sense in which I think it's a good thing they define that, okay, this will not be considered okay. And this will be. So those are important. I think the regulators are becoming active. Partly it's a demonstration effect, right? Whenever one regulator becomes active, the other kind of get on their toes.
The only issue I have is that there have been instances of at least perceptions of judicial overreach. You know what I'm referring to. So I think we should also avoid being, you know, labelled as a sort of hyper-regulated economy. In a small instances like the Uber case have been, you know, blown out of proportion as an indication of a sort of anti-innovation regulation. So we have to be careful about that image as well.
So display that, I mean, show that you're ready and to move and strike if the case may be, but be careful of oversight. We've run out of time, gentlemen. Thank you so much. That's all we have time for on this edition of Policy Watch. We'll be back next week, same time. Thanks for watching.